on exploring international relations research related to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to ask everyone to remember to mute themselves. We made the decision going into this event to make it in a meeting format instead of a webinar format. And that is so that as the event proceeds and near the end, we have a lot of time left over to be able to speak freely and have a dynamic discussion where we can all hear from you. But that also means that you need to mute while our speakers are speaking. So thank you all for joining us this morning. It is quite a momentous morning in the United States and around the world, really, as we see the inauguration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We're all excited about the future here. And I know there's a lot of competition for airwaves right now. So I want to thank you all for joining us. We have to admit that we were not kind of recognizing the momentousness of this date and this time when we scheduled it. So thank you so much for prioritizing us in this discussion, which is critically important to the future as well. So I'm just gonna jump right into it. This event is being hosted by the ISA Global Health section, and our purpose of hosting this webinar was to spend some time recognizing what the role of international relations research in particular can provide in understanding both the cause of the COVID-19 pandemic and also its response, and to generate a broader discussion within IR scholarship that can help contribute to understanding the global COVID-19 crisis. And finally, we're hoping that bringing us all together in this forum can just generate some ideas and some potential new projects and collaborations within our global health section and beyond. So the plan for our hour 15 minutes we have scheduled is to hear from two different speakers about their current COVID-19 research and also have a discussion. And so our first speaker, as you can see here, is going to be Amy Patterson from the University of the South and Emmanuel Balogun from the Skidmore College, and then followed by Heidi Twerk from the University of British Columbia. And finally, Jeremy Yaud will be discussing their research and then kind of bringing in some new ideas and then opening it up to a discussion from all of you. If you have something specific you'd like to run by this community and kind of highlight what you're doing and kind of generate some feedback, then hopefully we'll have some time for that at the end. So if you want to utilize the chat function, that is something that's also available to us through the meeting format. And I'm one that's all for multitasking in our new COVID pandemic age. So if you have comments and you have questions, go ahead and post them in the chat as we go along. We can come back to those potentially during our open discussion. And also it's there to be recorded so that we can go back and look at them and then respond to you or follow up with you later. So don't be shy about the chat function. And if you have something to say later on in the conversation, I ask that you just use the raise your hand tool in the meeting, or maybe wave profusely and I'll see you so that we could then call you during the open discussion, and I'll remind you of that when we get there. So we'll go ahead and get started with African responses to COVID-19, the reckoning of agency, and I believe Emmanuel Balogun will be starting, so I'm going to stop my share and allow him to share his slides.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you all for joining us. As mentioned, my name is Emmanuel Balogun, and I'm here with my colleague, Amy Patterson, and we're gonna talk about our paper that's forthcoming in the African Studies Review called African Responses to COVID-19, the Reckoning of Agency. So just to give sort of some context or overview of what the paper is about. So we came up with the paper and the idea for the paper, as we were watching how the narrative around Africa's response to COVID-19 was developing. My colleague Amy had an actual real disruption. She was in Tanzania and had to leave her Fulbright to come back to the United States as the outbreak was happening. And so I think a lot of what our initial thoughts of the paper came from sort of that immediacy of, what's going to happen on the continent. And so initially the narrative around COVID-19, was sort of this exceptionalist narrative that was one saying, well, does Africa as a continent have the capacity to deal with COVID-19? That Africa was as a continent would be disproportionately affected by COVID. And so what we ended up seeing, actually, especially in the early days, were that African countries were pretty were varied in their response in terms of lockdown, but there was also sort of the more macro measures, like things like the death rate was much lower, for example. Even though there were issues with tracking cases and numbers and things like that. But then because of this narrative, because we didn't see sort of this catastrophe on the continent, we began to also see narratives of, maybe this is surprising. It's so surprising that this is happening on the continent. So this probed us to think about, well, how can we explain these instances where there was a sort of a harmonized response that sort of offset these catastrophic projections, but then also what explains this variation? Because there were African countries that particularly did not take the pandemic seriously, and their government or their policy responses sort of reflected that. So the overview of the paper sort of examines the role of agency in terms of determining harmonized responses and varied national responses. And what we come away with, sort of one of our main contributions, is that so the role of African actors is very important here and matters in global governance, right? And so one of the things that we notice is this emergence, or what we argue is an emergence of an epistemic community around knowledge sharing, around using information from previous epidemics on the continent to sort of have African actors end up asserting themselves in the global health governance theater. And so we do this, and I could talk more about this, or Amy and I could talk more about this in the discussion part. We do this by using our own fieldwork research, and so interviews. We also look at some policy documents, and then we also look at some newspaper and media discourse as well. And so just real quick, we'll talk briefly about how we define agency in the paper, and then also why agency is used as a framework here. And so we define agency as the propulsive capacity of state or non-state actors to act or react, engage with, ignore, speak, or remain silent in these in international spaces. And we argue that in the paper that this occurs on many levels, across and within different contexts, and definitely across different scales of governance. And in the paper, we focus on the continental level. So we're looking specifically at the African Union and the African CDC, and then also state and society levels on the national level. So we're looking at how actors in both of those scales of governance display or have the capacity to demonstrate agency. And so again, as we use agency as the framework, right, as a way to understand how sort of where in the global response, particularly by Western countries, has been sort of isolationist, like this, the United States famously opting out of the World Health Organization, China going its own way, European countries as well, also, or the EU also acting sort of in a more insulated, responding in a more insulated way, not thinking about the response to COVID as something that necessitated a global response. And so within that, we're looking at how African agents then assert themselves in a space where at the time, at least, there was no global cooperation of the time of writing. And then there's also this other dynamic of inequality that the South African government and Jeffrey York is a Canadian journalist, often has been calling the vaccine apartheid. And this is the idea that the South African governments, other African governments have been highlighting this uncertainty of vaccine distribution in the developing world, and the unequal distribution of the vaccine in the developing world. And I should note that in the paper, we don't talk much about vaccine distribution because at the time of writing, there were no plans for vaccine distribution anywhere just yet, like we're seeing now. And so that's sort of why we're using agency as the framework. And then, so I'll talk a little bit more because, again, I think it's very important, I think, to talk about the vaccine, the deployment and distribution. Even though we don't talk about it in the paper, I think what we're seeing in real time reflects what we argue in the paper as well. And so there's, this tension between what we're seeing with Western countries in terms of vaccine nationalism, vaccine diplomacy, most notably Moderna and Pfizer, who have had their vaccines pre-purchased by the United States and European countries, have also deliberately opted out of distributing their vaccine to South Africa and other African countries and other developing countries. And this has, sort of created a tension there. Although this overt rejection by these pharmaceutical companies and the preference for to distribute in Western countries by these pharmaceutical countries has been prominent, we still see the African CDC, for example, being very aggressive and very sort of purposeful in trying to still pursue and obtain vaccines to distribute throughout the continent. And they have a 60% vaccination target and have secured about 270 have secured about 270 million vaccines to date in order to get to that target. Although, again, this has been, access to the vaccine has been very elusive to the Africa CDC. And then lastly, we see this from basically between Africa and China and their partnerships or pre-existing partnerships, this idea of vaccine diplomacy proliferated by China to sort of assert itself on the continent on the continent of Africa as a way to be a solution and not the cause of the pandemic, right? And so we see African governments then opting to use the Chinese and Russian developed vaccines as alternatives to Moderna and Pfizer, right? We also see the Jack Ma Foundation and some public-private partnerships between African governments and China in delivering over 400 tons of medical supplies, including testing kits and ventilators and things like that. And we do discuss a bit of that in the paper. But all of this is reflective of the various inflection points of agencies for African actors, right? That this idea that African countries and actors are still, on one hand, marginalized in the global health theater, but are also sort of have agentic capacity and have the ability to seek alternative partnerships and sometimes potentially suboptimal partnerships, but it doesn't stop, even though they have to engage in those partnerships or seek alternatives, it doesn't stop these actors from asserting themselves prominently in global health governance. And so I'll talk briefly about the ways in which we see this epistemic community and this and agency through the Africa CDC. And then Amy will take over and talk more about this on the national level. And so soon after the World Health Organization, actually prior to the World Health Organization's declaration of a public health emergency and also deeming this a pandemic, COVID-19, at the African Union, the Africa CDC developed a joint continental strategy on COVID-19. This was one of the first instances where we started to see this emergence of some epistemic knowledge sharing on the continent, mainly through what's called these weekly Africa CDC community of practice webinars. And so I think the group is now about 1,300, over 1,300 people, but it initially started out as a group of, again, it's about 700 in the first couple of weeks of health practitioners from community, traditional health leaders, all the way, traditional healers, all the way to medical doctors, all the way to ministers or people who worked in ministries of health in African Union member states, right? And so the point of this knowledge hub is actually what they call it as well, was to sort of bring together knowledge in a way, or share knowledge about how African countries from the community level to national level are on how they're going to develop responses, or how they're going to deploy PPE, for example, and then also create an online repository where anyone who wants information about how to respond to COVID in their local context, or how to communicate to their populations about being safe under COVID-19, could use this knowledge hub as a way to share information. We also saw the emergence of a consortium for COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials, which was also significant. We also saw a capacity agency through the Africa CDC in their collaboration with the World Health Organization. We know the Director General of the World Health Organization is also an African, so we see some solidarity ties there as well. But the main collaboration up until we see COVAX now with the distribution of the vaccine on the continent was PACT, or the CDC T3, which was a tracing, testing, and tracking regime for the World Health Organization to help African countries through the African CDC to fast track and accelerate their tracing, contact tracing and testing plans on the continent. We also saw a collaborative response between the Africa CDC, the West African Health Organization, and the World Health Organization, creating a task force on COVID-19 as well, again, to think about how to develop, for instance, risk communication. How do we prevent the spread of misinformation on the continent about COVID-19? And how do we sort of create a streamlined message from the World Health or from regional sub-regional organizations to the regional or continental level to the World Health Organization? How do we have this sort of singular harmonized message? But it wasn't all harmony, and we still did see some resistance to regional cooperation, even though the Africa CDC did sort of have one of the only regional organizations in the world to actually facilitate an overt harmonized response. And I'll point out one example or two examples that we talk about in the paper. One is the government of Tanzania shunning COVID briefings with the East African community and the Southern African Development Community. The government of Tanzania also declaring COVID-19 a hoax and saying that that they have solved the problem of COVID-19, even though there were lots of Instagram, social media stories about mass graves in Tanzania, people dying at a rapid rate from COVID-19 in Tanzania, even though, and the government denying some of that. And then there was also this some contestation around the use of CVO, which is a herbal remedy developed in Madagascar. And there was an eagerness by African countries to buy and distribute and use CVO, which the government of Madagascar ended up calling like a cure for coronavirus, right? And we talk about this because it highlights sort of, again, this collective agency in that even though many of the African governments, particularly Nigeria, was one who was very forthcoming saying, we're going to buy these, buy CVO, and we're going to test it to see how effective it is. But they made a point to still buy enough to distribute throughout the region, the sub-region of West Africa. Is this desire to resist this frame that African responses or African science or the use of traditional medicine is not taboo, or is not, or to resist this idea that is a deficient response to COVID-19, because at the same time, the World Health Organization was discouraging use of CVO and would reject the idea that CVO was a cure to coronavirus. And so this was another sort of instance where African knowledge was privileged, and the African countries tried to to promote that knowledge and legitimate that knowledge, again, as a way to assert itself in the global health governance theater. So with that, I'll hand it over to Amy to talk about the other dynamics we explained in the paper.
Thank you, Emmanuel. So as Emmanuel alluded to in the introduction, we look at agency sort of at two levels. First at the regional level or the continental level, and then secondly, we're interested at the national level, and most particularly, we focused on the engagement between African states and civil society, how they collaborated and how that illustrated aspects of agency, particularly in terms of around a message of solidarity and also in terms of trying to have a harmonized response. And as we read through news media and we looked at particular country case studies, we sort of distilled four patterns in this state civil society collaboration. Certainly there are others, but the ones that we draw on and illustrate in the paper. The first one really is the first point here is really about religious and traditional and community level organizations. So Emmanuel, I don't know if it's there. Oh, perfect. So, throughout the continent, traditional organizations and religious leaders, religious organizations have a lot of clout. They have a lot of legitimacy. Their leaders are highly regarded and highly trusted. And we saw that states often did collaborate very early on with these types of organizations because of their local reach. And that helped to, again, create a harmonized response within at the subnational level and at the national level. So just one example we give in the paper is South African community-based organizations, particularly those working on HIV and AIDS, collaborated with local government officials on food delivery and food distribution for people living with HIV. The second point that sort of builds on the first, really, I guess, in terms of patterns, is that civil society organizations, in conjunction with the state, oftentimes then tried to tap into prior experiences and networks and institutions that had been developed around health and development issues in the past. And here you see that they are building on prior knowledge and prior experiences. So one example we give in the paper is Ghanaian churches. The Christian Council of Ghana worked pretty strongly in the Ebola outbreak in 2014, 2015 on Ebola messaging, and they collaborated with the state, with state media, with local officials, et cetera. And then they used those networks to also educate about COVID. And COVID prevention. The third pattern that we see is really this agency that comes through creativity and self-reliance and moving beyond reliance on donor organizations or your typical NGOs that are involved on health and development to develop these public-private partnerships. Sometimes on the instigation of the state, but sometimes on the instigation of civil society actors or individuals. So one example is Facebook has in several countries, one we pointed to is Rwanda, but in several countries has set up COVID information centers in community organizations, community buildings, district government offices to provide information about the prevention of COVID. And then those also will be used for providing information, I'm assuming, about a vaccine once that is more readily available. And then the final pattern that we see is governments acting or the state acting, but actually not in collaboration or with limited interaction with civil society organizations. And here we have two examples in the paper of one Emmanuel has already mentioned, Tanzania. Tanzania is really sort of inaction on COVID. It's denial of the virus. It's, it just pretty early on quit even reporting numbers of cases. But part of that also is we have seen very minimal civil society pushback and mobilization around COVID. So really not a partnership there. And the other example, in the case of Uganda, certainly the government took took the virus very seriously. It engaged in lockdown, and there it built on an epistemic community that it already had developed around prevention of Ebola from DRC. But much of Uganda's actions, pretty stringent curfew, et cetera, was done without consultation with civil society organizations, particularly human rights organizations and women's organizations. So we've seen that the curfews, for example, have prevented people from actually accessing healthcare for non-COVID related issues like, prenatal care for women. So in summary, when we think about agency in amongst African states at the continental level and at the subnational level, even with civil society, I think we could make some general statements. The first is that solidarity, there's a desire for solidarity, there's a desire for harmonization, but we don't in the paper argue that harmonization is always there. We recognize that that desire is there, but it is not absolute. And that African actors have maneuvered at all kinds of levels, and we see agency playing out in multiple ways, building on prior knowledge, building on culturally relevant tools, building on prior networks and institutions and capacity that existed in dealing with other health and development issues. But we know that these patterns of agency vary greatly with governance structures. If thinking about the example of Tanzania versus, another case that has been Uganda, or with infrastructures, or also with health systems. And areas for future research would be to think about how those forms of harmonization and solidarity and how those epistemic communities do vary more with governance structures, and also on other issues, scientific, health, technical issues such as climate change. So we see lots of areas for future research. So just a final word of thank you. Thank you for being here on a day where we know there are other things going on. Thank you also, Jeremy and Heather. Thank you for organizing and for the comments that you'll provide. And we look forward to any of your comments and suggestions and ideas for future research.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Emmanuel and Amy. Such interesting work. I feel so selfish putting together this panel because really I just wanted to hear all this amazing stuff. So I'm already so thrilled. Let's go ahead and move on to Heidi and have Heidi's presentation before we open it up for discussion. So Heidi, you're on.
Thanks so much. Okay. All right, well, thank you all so much for being here, as Amy and Emmanuel said, and thank you to Jeremy and for his comments in advance, and to Heather for organizing. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here as well. And you'll see, I think, in some ways that my presentation does build on a few of the points that Amy and Emmanuel were making, particularly about the role of civil society, and maybe even the kind of implicit, explicit point underneath that those who have done an effective job in containing COVID have confounded all the expectations that many people might have had before, including those like the Global Health Security Index, the compilers of that, who in 2019, of course, put the US and the UK as the top two most prepared countries, when we found that that was indeed very far from the case when the pandemic unfolded. And more to the point, as the pandemic continued, foreign policy tried to catch up and then released its own version of a ranking saying who had performed best. At one point in their ranking, Senegal was number 2. Which I think nobody may have predicted from foreign policy or elsewhere beforehand, reminding us of how much many people didn't see in terms of capacity and capability and what it really means to deal with infectious diseases. And I would argue, as someone who's a specialist on communications, that one of the things that many people failed to understand was the fundamental role of communications as a non-pharmaceutical intervention. And so I put together a team that includes all the people down here to look at how health communications unfolded during the first 6 months of COVID-19 in 9 countries on 5 continents. So we worked together using media sources, policy reports, a few interviews, and looking at this in all of the original languages, hence why we needed a massive team. And I'll tell you in a second which countries. And the idea here in many ways sprung from my own work on communications, frequently seeing that many of the people talking about communications during the pandemic was saying things like Bill Gates, who back in April of 2020, when he outlined in quite a lengthy blog post how he thought that the world was going to get out of the pandemic, as someone who'd been sounding the whistle and sounding alarms on pandemics for a long time, he only produced one sentence on communications saying, it will take a lot of good communication so that people understand what the risks are and feel comfortable going back to work or school. So there are many questions that arise from this single sentence. One is that he sees communications only as something that takes you out of a pandemic, not as something that's integral from the beginning. And then, of course, it raises the fundamental question, what on earth do you mean by good communication? It's not as simple as Gates makes it appear in this one sentence. So what we did in this is to really sort of go back to the drawing board and say, listen, we've all learned about non-pharmaceutical interventions, we got masks, physical distancing, etc. There's lots of great studies trying to look into and measure the effects of each one of these. But what you fundamentally need are effective communications to make that happen. We can think about masks as an obvious example there in a place like the US, where something became massively politicized, helping us to understand that communications was really at the heart of the problems there. So how we communicate, who communicates, all those basic questions of the who, what, where, when, how, and why are what contribute to making communications, we thought, a kind of foundational non-pharmaceutical intervention to help with all of the other NPIs. The second thing was observing that pandemic communications, of course, intersected with multiple existing crises that made communications hard. Populism, the erosion of local journalism, particularly in this kind of phase, the world of anti-vaxxer activism. The third thing we wanted to think about, because one of my collaborators, Ian Beacock, is a specialist on the history of democracy, was to think about what it meant to have democratic communications. What did it mean for democracies to communicate around COVID-19, which is a slightly different approach than a lot of others are taking, who are just comparing countries regardless of their political systems. We wanted to know, was there something particular about effective democratic communications? And then finally, an interdisciplinary approach. So we pulled people in as advisors who are epidemiologists, and also some people from think tanks as well, because what we decided to do, given that this was a crisis, was to produce a policy report that was freely available as quickly as possible, in the hope that that could be used by officials in both British Columbia, but also internationally. So we produced a policy report actually in September. So what I'm describing was all published in a policy report, and I'll put in the link in the chat. And the hope is this, provides a foundation for academic work. But given the crisis that was unfolding, we wanted to have this research available to as many people as quickly as possible. Okay, so what we did is we looked, as I said, at 9 countries around the world, ones that we thought were potentially doing effective jobs, but also some that were high in the headlines, and we wanted to really know whether what people were saying about places like Sweden being laissez-faire were actually true. So we looked at South Korea, Taiwan, Germany, New Zealand, Canada, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Senegal. And then because some of those places had federal health systems, like Canada, where actually the provinces are the ones who have decided upon basically everything bar international border controls. We did a comparison of British Columbia, which has had a relatively effective response, with Ontario, which has had a much more difficult response and is currently actually in a very, very strict lockdown because of the explosion of cases, which is a contrast to BC. So with each of those, I've said we had researchers who were looking in the original languages to understand what kinds of communications were happening on all sorts of basic levels, who was doing the communicating, etc. And what we came up with by the end was, of course, we could see that each of these places was contextual in the ways that they dealt with communications. But in thinking about what made for effective communications, we came up with what we called the rapid principles of democratic public health communications. Of course, not each one of those 9 places displayed all 5 of these principles, and how they worked in each place could unfold quite differently. And I'd be happy to give you lots more examples, but what I'm going to do is just run through each one of these principles with an example from one of these 9 places, so you can get a sense of how they work. Because what we really wanted to show is you can't simply call it good communications. That really has no meaning. That implies you just plop some facts up on a website and people all of a sudden, do what you want them to do. But in fact, if you look at what makes for effective communications, you find that it's actually much more complex. And of course, some of these principles are fairly basic. And even if we look at CDC handbooks which were followed, for example, by Washington State. And we see that lots of these things are in there already, but some of them are not. So it's to say we are not completely reinventing the wheel with this, but some of it does build on and show that countries that simply followed some basic principles, like attending to emotions, performed much better than those that did not. Okay, so the first one is perhaps the most surprising, the R, relying on autonomy rather than orders. So this doesn't mean that orders aren't effective at all, that you don't have, of course, some public health guidelines, but what we found is that having clear guidelines around hygiene measures and trying to build rapport with a population tended to work better than draconian measures that came with fines. This involves trust in a population, long-term rapport building over shaming and blaming, which in fact in the long run tend to undermine the desire of a population to actually work with public health officials, particularly as this became a long-run crisis. And more to the point, enforcement and fines tend to target marginalized populations, who themselves, ironically, are the ones who have been most affected in most countries by this pandemic. So the main example that we pulled out here was British Columbia, which, despite having one of the most successful actually responses of all of Europe and North America, has used fines very, very lightly. There basically were no fines until the late summer. Bonnie Henry, the chief medical officer, has relied instead on rapport building, on talking about pro-social policies, pushing people to want to comply, taking a long time actually to put in a mask mandate. In part, that's helped to forestall anti-mask demonstrations, so that it got to the point where the population was begging her to put in a mask mandate rather than putting one in earlier. And we've seen that she's become, in fact, within British Columbia and even within Canada, the actually most quoted woman over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. She even had John Fluvog. Some of you who buy shoes might know John Fluvog, but he's a shoe designer in British Columbia who's also internationally well known, even designed a shoe for her, which you can see here. So in fact, the idea that what you need is orders enforced by police with fines, as we've seen in many other places. British Columbia belies the idea that that is the way that you get to an effective methodology of communication, right? So how do you communicate and get people to comply? We've seen guidelines here, much more reliance on autonomy, giving people as much space as you can, helping them have layers of protection rather than using fines as the only way to get people to comply. The second thing we found was the A of rapid, attending to values, emotions, and stories. So of course, facts matter, but finding different ways to provide values, emotions, and stories. In the case of British Columbia, one of the things that Bonnie Henry has consistently said as one of her slogans is be kind, be calm, be safe, giving people a kind of emotional apparatus that you can see as you walk around downtown Vancouver. I'm now sitting, you'll see businesses, right, with signs outside saying be kind. So it gave people a vocabulary there. We found in places like New Zealand, that was similarly true, where Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, through her Facebook Live conversations through COVID, tried to put forward similar emotions of kindness, solidarity, and so on. In Taiwan, that took a very different approach, where officials maintained the idea that their strategy was humor over rumor, that the way to combat disinformation was to have humor before you thought about rumors. So this is one example where they would use the spokesdog of Taiwan, the Zhongchai, to tell you how to maintain social distancing. Others used individual stories as another way of doing that, but trying to supply the underlying values that were pro-social, different types of emotions you might have, kindness, calmness, and so on, to give people a handle on how to behave. And the third, which builds on, I think, what Amy and Emmanuel really neatly laid out as different kinds of ways of bringing in government and civil society. We saw a lot of places that were successful, pulling in citizens and civil society, and that was very contextual depending upon the country or province that we were talking about. So in the case of Senegal, this was one place that did this really from the start, in many ways learning from Ebola, again, as Amy and Emmanuel pointed out for Ghana, so they could draw on a lot of the lessons learned there. So in the case of Senegal, there were various people brought in, principally religious leaders, but not just Muslim leaders, also Christian leaders as well from the start, to show on Facebook, for example, imams washing their hands, maintaining social distance, ensuring that services were not held in person, something that has really been a problem in many other countries. You think of the US, Canada, etc., that not pulling in religious leaders from the start has been one of the key errors, because you've really lost a huge amount of the population who aren't going to listen to politicians, but would listen to their religious leaders, something we've seen Senegal do very effectively. There were rap songs. There's a rap song in French and Wolof telling people to wash their hands, keep their distance, and even graffiti artists. There's a particular group called RBS in Dakar who produced this graffiti that you can see here, incredibly beautiful, reminding people to wear a mask for protection. The fourth thing that we found was very sort of basically a question of institutional capacity, that in order to reach people where they were at, whether it was Snapchat or Line or whatever else it was, you needed to have massive institutional capacity. And this was something that we really found in Taiwan and South Korea above all. So Taiwan after SARS in 2002-03, and South Korea after a MERS outbreak in 2015, both countries underwent legal and institutional reforms to their public health guidelines. Now, this of course involved all sorts of things beyond communications, but just to focus on the communications aspect, both countries recognized that this was really crucial in preventing rumor, increasing compliance, and really making sure that that was embedded from the start. So South Korea, for example, has an Office of Communications, which is mandated to work on epidemic communication, and very early within the pandemic did things like brought in 50 citizens to tell them whether the communications was good or not. And one of the things that other studies have found is that actually the compliance, for example, in South Korea with public health guidelines was far greater during the COVID crisis than it was during the 2015 MERS crisis, where there was a lot of rumor and dissatisfaction. So what we find here is that the high level of compliance in places like South Korea and Taiwan with public health guidelines has less to do with anything related to cultures of Confucianism or all sorts of other strange assumptions that have been floating around the media, and much more to do with basic institutional capacity and the ability to reform. So many of the problems with communication have less to do with, say, the individuals involved in public health and more to do with the institutional capacity to meet people where they were at. And this involved all sorts of other things in Taiwan and South Korea, including providing laptops to those who didn't have laptops. In Taiwan, it meant expanding internet accessibility to those who were in places where there wasn't as much internet accessibility. So that institutionalization had all sorts of different facets that proved to be very crucial, that you needed to be there to be able to operate on the get-go rapidly when the crisis unfolded. And finally, the thing we looked at was how different countries and provinces described the pandemic. What did it mean to describe it democratically? So we found that there were all sorts of different metaphors that different countries chose to try and describe the pandemic in ways that indicated that even though each of us has our own situation, we are in fact in this together and we are combating this in some way democratically. So South Korea chose the relay race, that everybody's sort of running and giving each other the baton. New Zealand went for team. British Columbia decided that it would talk about this in terms of a natural disaster, hurricanes, wildfires, storms as well, with the idea that everybody is in a boat, but we're all in different types of boats. Some people have a luxury yacht and some people are in a very leaky dinghy. So while we all have the same storm, our ability to deal with it can differ in different ways. By contrast, places that have really struggled with the pandemic tended to use military metaphors. That was true in Ontario, but we've also seen that in places like the UK as well, talking about battling the pandemic, etc., which we found had problems from a democratic standpoint. Okay, so just to wrap up, I mean, one of the main things that we were trying to do was take a very different approach than most of the other people working on communications during this pandemic. So most people, including the WHO, which hosted a large conference in the summer that I participated in, all of these have focused on what's now being called the infodemic. So the idea of the massive spread of very unreliable information, whether it is about Bill Gates and vaccines, as we see on the right here, microchips, etc. 5G was another one that in the UK led to actually real problems for companies like Vodafone because people were attacking 5G masts, quack cures, etc., etc. I could go on and on. So most of the research has focused on that kind of world of proliferating poor quality information. And what we've decided to do here in this report was to focus on the opposite, which is how do you get high quality information? Does that matter? And what does it look like? And indeed, you can see we've outlined a huge number of ways in which public health officials have found methods to deliver high quality information that in other studies was found to be effective. But one of the crucial aspects of it, and why we ended up with this RAPID acronym, was that the rapidity of the delivery of that information also mattered. So it wasn't just what you did and how and who, it was when you did it. And studies that have looked at this looked at, for example, 12 countries around the world, and whether they searched for, and people within those countries searched for and bought quack cures or not, have found that the faster that governments put out solid public health guidelines, the fewer people within those countries searched for and purchased quack cures. So the RAPID acronym is not just something to be cute, but it's actually building on the findings of others who've looked at big data studies on why it is that the provision of high quality information by public health officials is crucial and matters. Okay, so to conclude, one of the basic things here is obviously the importance of contextual comparison. It's why we came up with principles rather than what policy people like to call a playbook, because who the civil society are and how you interact with them looks very different in Senegal than it does in, say, Sweden. The second thing was the more we dug into this, the more we wanted to push for people to avoid the fallacies of cultural essentialism. The idea that people comply in South Korea because of some sort of underlying culture. Instead, we found this was about institutions and institutional reform. And thirdly, that what I think this study shows and reminds us is that communications is a crucial non-pharmaceutical intervention, inseparable though in many ways from broader governance questions. All right, I'll end there. Thank you very much. And I'll pop in the chat the link to the report if any of you want to read more. Thanks so much and looking forward to comments.
Wow, thank you, Heidi. As someone who is currently in Los Angeles, the global hotspot for the COVID pandemic, I now feel like I just got a comprehensive review of how we failed. I think Los Angeles failed every single one of the RAPID principles. So thank you for that insight. That was incredible to follow along with that. All right, so let's go ahead and open this up. And Jeremy, why don't you go ahead and give us your feedback and launch us into our discussion.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks, Heather, for helping to organize this. Thanks to our panelists for really fascinating papers, and thanks to our friends at the ISA headquarters for helping to get all the tech set up and getting the information out about this. As folks have mentioned, obviously this is a big day here in the United States, but it's also a very appropriate day to be talking about these sorts of things, because one of the first orders that now President Biden has said he'll do today is to rejoin the World Health Organization. And so this is obviously a very important topic and something that is very much links up with contemporary issues. In the two presentations, there were three things that I think really linked both of them together in very different sorts of contexts, but spoke to each other really well. One was this notion of learning from the past. It seems like there's a lot of it, having previous experience is actually really relevant for this, and allowed for states that maybe you wouldn't automatically think we're going to be the ones that we're going to be able to respond really well, actually could make those adaptations. They kind of had that muscle memory, if you will. And I think we saw that in both of these papers. Second is the importance of trust. And as Heidi framed it, thinking about communication and trust as a non-pharmaceutical intervention beyond vaccines, beyond masks, beyond all of these other sorts of things. But that's a crucial element here. If if the government is going to encourage or say you need to take different steps, you need to change your behaviors, you need to have some measure of trust there in order to feel like that is something you're going to be willing to do. And so drawing on these different partners can actually be a really important element of that. And then the third thing I think really came through in both papers was the importance of nuance, that we have this overarching sort of framework, but then we have to be contextually specific. We have to adapt these sorts of ideas to make sure that they're going to resonate with the communities that we're trying to reach. And so in some ways it complicates the process, but I think it also helps us to understand that there is not just a single one size fits all. Tedros can go out and say everyone needs to do this one thing and it's going to work out. So I really appreciated how these papers both spoke to each other. And I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for folks to ask questions and get involved in this discussion. Just a few very quick things. Amy and Emmanuel, I'm a sucker for a paper about epistemic communities, so I appreciated you bringing this into it. And I'm curious about two things in particular. One is about those outliers or those states like Tanzania, like Madagascar, that were maybe not towing the party line, if you will, and just kind of what sort of justification did they use? Were they framing this in terms of, when the outside world comes in and tries to force some sort of public health intervention, this goes bad for sub-Saharan African states? Or, were they drawing on this sort of rhetoric? Was it connected to other sorts of things? Was it connected to a sense of populism within the governments? I'm just curious if there are any sorts of commonalities there. And then the second thing was, I'm curious if you can speak to the African CDC itself, and what might give it some of these powers, or this ability to reach out to these countries, to bring together these communities of practice and do these webinars. Has it just, it's a relatively new institution, but how has it been able to develop that rapport that has allowed it to engage in these sorts of cross-border conversations? Because I think that's a really important element. The fact that you've got this supranational institution that's able to bring together these players. And I'm just wondering if there are lessons that we can learn that even, say, the World Health Organization can learn in terms of its own engagement with member states working on both COVID and on other sorts of health-related issues. Heidi, this is really great thinking about the role of communication, and I really like the way that you talked about it as this non-pharmaceutical intervention. This is something that I've noticed even just here in the States, looking at what happens here in Minnesota vis-a-vis Iowa and Wisconsin and the Dakotas. Just the way that you see that trust that gets built up, the willingness to engage in that conversation plays such a big role in the broader political conversation. I also had no idea that Taiwan has a spokes dog, and I am all for more governments in this world having spokes dogs. And there were two things that particularly was interested in your presentation. One was this point that you made about the delay in the mask mandate in British Columbia and kind of building this popular support. And I get what you're saying, but that also kind of, it seems counterintuitive in some respects. And so I'm curious if you can just talk a little bit more about that delay and both how that helped to, how the public pressure helped to build, but then also were there the epidemiological trade-offs that happened because of the delay in the mask mandate? Did that allow for more cases? And then the second thing is, I'm wondering about the cases that you talk about. A lot of these are some of the shining stars that we've seen in the COVID response. And I'm wondering, and this kind of picks up on what Heather was talking about, what about governments that just, they fall on their faces in their initial outset? Is there a way to reset this process? Can they get themselves back on track? Or do you need to have a wholesale change in who the personnel are? Does it become a lost cause at some point? Or is there a way to try to fix those sorts of things? But I'm really looking forward to seeing Amy and Emmanuel's paper out in print. I'm really looking forward to reading the paper that Heidi and her team put out. And I will encourage everyone else to use the chat function or to raise your hand to get Heather's attention, because I think there's a lot of really good stuff in both these papers. So thank you to our three panelists.
Thanks, Jeremy. Amy and Emmanuel, do you want to respond first to some of those comments?
Sure. Emmanuel, I could take the first question that Jeremy raised, and you could take the one on the Africa CDC. But before I address that first question, I think this point that that Jeremy has raised about learning from the past is so interesting, because I was just really struck when Heidi put up about Senegal, because Senegal, of course, has been really heralded early in the AIDS epidemic for its work with communities. So it's learning from that, it's learning from Ebola, it's, but it's also striking, I think, why don't other countries learn from the past, right? I mean, like, we had the AIDS epidemic in the US, why did we not learn about community mobilization or messaging in the US and apply those lessons? But to your question about these outliers in terms of these states that were sort of unwilling to toe the party line, and here, Tanzania just keeps sticking out in the African context. You know, I think that one thing we try to bring up in the paper is that harmonization and solidarity is not absolute. And anybody that studies about African Union or African unity would also make that point, right? That we're not so simplistic that we think that all African states act the same and have exactly the same interest. And, you know, in this context, I think it's really important to recognize Tanzania's political and developmental history, its socialist experience, state-led development under Julius Nyerere. I think it's also important to recognize, as I alluded to, that civil society, unlike in some other African countries, does not have as much capacity. It has not been as involved in policy advocacy, I would assert. And then, you know, as a more proximate consideration, it was an election year. John Magufuli is definitely a charismatic, dynamic guy. And I think Tanzania's more recent political trajectory also played into this. So history, culture, civil society, a wide variety of contextual variables that would lead a country to maybe play that outlier role in a positive or a negative, you know, way. So, and Emmanuel, if you want to speak on the second.
Yeah, no, and I think that's you raised a great question, Jeremy, and I think this is something that, you know, to the theme of wanting to build future papers, I think this would be something to really focus on. I would probably identify a couple of areas, right? Well, so the fact that you brought up how the Africa CDC is a relatively new institution. It is new, about 5 years old, but 4 years old in practice. But I think the speed in which the Africa CDC was scaled up to, you know, being operational kind of signifies, you know, the priority that African governments have placed on the Africa CDC. And also, if you look at sort of the broader trajectory and the broader institutional goals of the African Union, there's a really just focus on sort of collective ownership over its own over the affairs of Africa. You know, I mean, early when it changed from the OAU to African Union, you know, there's this whole African solutions to African problems bit, but it's really evolved to this argument mainly about sustainability, right? Even though China has had you know, a heavy hand in terms of, you know, funding the actual building that the African Union is in. There's all of the, and it's had a heavy hand in a lot of sort of the governance spaces on the continent. There's also this narrative, you talk to anyone who works for the AU, particularly the Africa CDC, that there is this desire for ownership, right? And so I think that sort of trickles down into the institutional tentacles, if you will. So there's all these regional collaboration centers within the Africa CDC that's able to be sort of another touch point for national governments to rely on. You know, establishing places like, for instance, the Nigerian CDC as a center of excellence for health, right? Like, you know, so there's all this sort of visibility that the Africa CDC really rapidly developed as well. And then I also would attribute it to leadership. So that the Director General of the Africa CDC has had experience working for the U.S. CDC, has you know lots of international bureaucratic experience in the area of public health, has built, you know, personal ties with the Director General for the World Health Organization as well. And I think sort of that dynamic of leadership of the head of the Africa CDC, sort of again inserting himself in conversations with the World Health Organization, prioritizing the partnerships with not just the World Health Organization, but other partners within Africa, but then beyond, and in prioritizing things like public and private partnership, and making sure that it's, you know, putting that branding of the Africa CDC, if you will, on things, I think has been really instrumental to facilitating harmonization. And you know, I think developing this rapport that amongst member states as well, that there's also sort of this buy-in by countries that, you know, this ought to be the venue in which we as the African continent negotiate as a voice for vaccines, for PPE, things of that nature. So.
All right, great. Thanks, Heidi. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, Jeremy, learning from the past, that's music to my ears as somebody who's half in a history department. And actually, I mean, there's something in the to-do writing list is absolutely about this point, because sometimes what we assume is that learning from the past has to be the recent past. And those are these examples like Senegal, Taiwan, South Korea. But there was also the fascinating example of New Zealand, whose pandemic plan is actually based on its experiences from the 1918-19 flu pandemic. And it actually explicitly thanks, in the beginning, the historian Geoffrey Rice, who wrote about New Zealand's experience during that pandemic and identifies, for example, that communications was a real problem. So we can see examples where actually, taking from that very, long ago, century ago past has also helped in the case of New Zealand. So that's one point. And then the other is that we can also see the problems of learning from the past if you have the wrong analogy. So I would argue that one of the problems for Europe and maybe even the US was learning the wrong lessons from H1N1. Oh, we kind of got away with it. It wasn't that bad. Hence the sort of rhetoric, it's just the flu. And many of the pandemic plans within Europe as well are based on flus, and the inability to move fast enough to recognize some of what was going on, I think, was because of that H1N1 experience. Also, I think some of the focus on surfaces, the inability to understand it was about shared air early enough. There are some legacies there as well. So I think it's a bit of a, in this paper we'll write, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? You can learn from the past, but if you're too inflexible, you apply the wrong analogy, you end up in a problematic place. Yeah, the delay in the mask mandate in BC, it's a great question. One reason this could happen is because there were so few cases. During the summer, in a province of 5 million, there were 5 to 10 cases a day. And people were encouraged from the start to meet outside, right? So we can all argue about things that were potentially not done that well within BC. No place was perfect. But one thing that they sort of tried to insist on from the beginning was fewer faces, outdoor spaces was another slogan. There are all these slogans. The Bonnie Henry pushed back against the idea that you shouldn't be going outside, consistently saying it is better for people to meet outside. So at the point when you have 5 to 10 cases a day during the summer, you have a room for maneuver that is completely different than a lot of other places. So that, and in part, that was because of the well done communication earlier in the pandemic as well. But that meant you could delay a bit. It started by having a mask mandate in public transportation. So there was one from, I believe it was late August, there was a mask mandate in public transportation. Obviously greater encouragement to wear masks. People started doing it voluntarily. And then in early November came the mask mandate in indoor public spaces. But you basically had some room for maneuver. I think we can argue with epidemiologists about whether it should have come earlier, say September, before you started getting a rise in cases. But I think part of it was just you had a room for maneuver you built for yourself with prior communications. The other aspect I would add is there is a huge Asian Canadian community that was already wearing masks. And so that, East Asian Canadian community. So it wasn't like masks were unknown to quite a large part of the population of Vancouver, at least. And those had been people who were wearing masks from January onwards. And if you look actually the epidemiology of the pandemic in BC, the place that has had the fewest number of cases is kind of a suburb of Vancouver called Richmond, which is the place with the highest number of East Asian Canadians. So I think that's part of the explanation as well. Final thing, can governments reset? Yeah, I mean, there's obviously the opposite, where you do well in wave 1 and then you really mess up in wave 2. Alberta is a great example of that. We can think of many others, but you can reset in different ways. So one thing we found is that while many governments were unwilling to apologize or admit mistakes, if you actually do, it builds trust. So in the case of Norway, the Prime Minister, Erna Solberg, apologized in the summer and said, I realized actually the lockdown was too severe and it wasn't necessary given the number of cases, and I apologize. And that actually ended up building trust. And what we've seen too little of with other governments in terms of reset is admitting those mistakes, which ends up building trust, right? Instead, it's the kind of PR spin stuff. And then to give maybe one US example of 2 different states of how you can reset. I mean, Michigan is an example of a place that was in deep trouble, but through its pause strategy over the last few months has gone from, I think it was the 6th largest prevalence of COVID per capita to now 44th. That's impressive. Versus a place like Ohio, where DeWine did a good job at the beginning with the chief public health officer, and then it kind of fell apart in the summer. So it can go in both directions, and I think we'll continue to see as the pandemic unfolds, whether other governments are able to reset. I mean, the US is obviously going to be the big experiment here. You know, what will change post today, and how much difference can that make? And maybe the final thing I would say, because Heather alluded to this, is this does not, I think, in the case of communications, at all split down Republican versus Democrat. It's not at all clear that that's a good way of assessing this. I mean, the communications, I think, from California and New York have been problematic, to put it mildly, and they've sort of contravened a huge number of our principles, including one of our basic principles was who should be communicating, and it should not be solely politicians. And that in California and New York, I think, has been massively to the detriment. And as Heather noted, many of the other principles in contravene too. So this is not, this is actually not going to, I think, fall out as a Republican state versus Democrat state governor's story. It will be much more complicated and more interesting.
Great, thank you. And so, yeah, we'll open it up if other people have some comments or questions. I've been interested, just as I've been listening, I keep thinking of the book by Richard Packard, The History of Global Health. I'm not sure if any of you have read that, but it really goes through this, you know, this pendulum swing between social determinants and behavioral approaches to technology and tool approaches. And for some reason, this keeps coming up and reminding me as you're speaking, because it seems to be in places where you've been able to engage people in their behaviors and think about social determinants in a broader perspective, they've had a more successful approach potentially than in communities, especially like in the United States, where we're so set on having these quick fix tools and been so focused on this vaccine solution, or that there's going to be something like magical technology that's going to come in and rescue us and move us forward. And so I feel like this is the next chapter in that book in some ways as well, and thinking about systems that have prioritized behavior and communities versus systems that have really prioritized like hierarchical technological solutions that can be implemented over everyone and solve the problem for us. So thank you for kind of getting that kind of going in my mind. One of the questions I had asked, and maybe this is a little bit kind of off to the side, but Emmanuel mentioned many times, you know, the future of these issues around Africa and equity and global health is really now looking at this vaccine challenge. And I guess I heard the Director General this week mention that at the opening of the executive board, that 35 million doses had been given out worldwide, and only 25 in the lowest income countries in the world, 25 vaccines period, and that this was going to be our greatest moral failure moving forward. And so obviously I'm super interested in this global inequities and how this nationalism around vaccines is playing out. And so I guess, Emmanuel, I'm a little confused about the CDC's, Africa CDC's role in this. And I've seen these headlines and these articles about how they procured and purchased all of these doses to serve to Africa. And we have the COVAX and these different systems. So where is the real hang up now? Is it that they've purchased them, but they're far back in line, so it's going to be, before production reaches them, it's going to be so long? Or can you give me any clear idea about where some of these hangups are happening now?
Yeah, you know, and I'm sort of seeing this in real time too. So, you know, my understanding of it is that, yeah, that there's, you know, the pre-purchased, but then also by the time they're able to get enough to distribute, that it's still not going to be able to be enough to. I think sort of the distribution, also being able to store the vaccines, things like that have been sort of the hang up. But then it's also, I think, that the choices by actual pharmaceutical companies to actually sell to African governments. So I think that's also been the hurdle, that there's just, you know, I think, you know, in the Africa CDC portion of it is trying to negotiate for the continent, right? Whereas you have a country like South Africa, who's also been very, you know, forthcoming in trying to work with the different pharmaceutical companies and not really, you know, getting through. So I think that, and also the fact that other countries are, or particularly the United States and Canada, have been buying up a lot more than they even need for at least in the Canadian case. And so that fact that, you know, for instance, I think Canada got I think 414 million of the Moderna vaccine, which is more than, you know, I think twice as much as what they need. That then is not a part of the pool to be redistributed, and that the fact that then African countries are now, you know, dependent again on countries like Canada for saying, well, if we have excess, we'll donate it, right? Like there's this intentionally, there's now this reliance again that reproduces the inequity of, okay, I now have to wait for these developed countries, if you will, if you want to use that frame, to use the vaccines that are, you know, that they've bought up, or have, you know, sort of a monopoly on the access to those vaccines. We get whatever the scraps are, and who knows how long that's going to take. I also saw another map that, and I'll end on this point. I saw another map that showed that in order for the continent to get to have the majority of its population vaccinated, it won't be until 2023, right? And so, whereas in the United States, in Canada, Australia, Europe, you know, they're looking at 2021, late 2021, 2022, right? So what does that then mean for being able to do business on the continent? What does that mean for people to move about the continent, and, you know, get back to a sense of normalcy on the continent? So I think that's what I was trying to highlight in sort of the inequalities. And I think the hang up is that, yeah, you know, African countries are further down the line. And, you know, the African CDC has been beneficial in the sense that they're able to negotiate for the continent as a whole. But that doesn't get to the problem of, okay, how would we even be able to distribute this in a way, or have enough to distribute in an equitable way? And that also creates problems on the continent too.
Yeah, really, really interesting points. I know I've been following some of the intellectual property agreements and issues, and those also seem to be really delayed. And like you said, the pharmaceuticals not really buying in. I know we have another ISA Global Health Section member, Mao Suzuki, who's been looking at the emergence of public-private partnerships around various areas, and then looking at COVID-19, they haven't emerged yet. So is it, you know, when along this timeline are we going to see pharmaceuticals willing to start sharing or participating in these partnerships? So it'll be interesting to see what has to happen before they're willing to. All right, we only have a couple minutes, so I don't know if anyone has any final comments or questions, but I do want to take the opportunity to thank ISA for facilitating this webinar and offering us the opportunity to have this discussion and to get these ideas flowing. I want to thank all of our panelists and speakers for joining us this morning and sharing with us their fantastic work. And obviously all of our participants for joining us and prioritizing this topic on what is a historic day. I want to just wish all of you health and safety at this time. And I look forward to seeing you all in person at an ISA conference, hopefully in 2022, if not before. So thank you all again so much for joining. And I hope to talk to you all really soon.